Gideon is a miserable loser who gets fired from the hero's party for being utterly useless. Now broke, he leaves the country to become a legal drug dealer, but everything changes when a hot princess begs to move in and repays his kindness by getting freaky.
I just can't wait to see.
This story begins one random afternoon as Gideon walks into a local guild to exchange some medicinal herbs for cash. When three adventurers suddenly start mocking him for carrying his useless bronze sword everywhere, he claims to not care about the glory of becoming a legendary warrior because his dream is to own a pharmacy. However, after returning to his shabby apartment later on, he thinks back to the night he got fired and blames Ares for turning him into a local clown before forcing himself to sleep through the depression. While searching for more herbs the next day, he senses the presence of an owlbear and quickly jumps on a branch before resisting the urge to carve a hole in its chest. Minutes later, he makes it back to town and finds all the local adventurers gathered outside. When Albert tells him about the bear and asks for his help, he turns down the offer, and Albert immediately loses it because simply guiding them will give him an automatic promotion to rank C. However, Gideon still refuses and reminds them that his dream is to own a shop and live quietly, so Albert and the others head out while the guild receptionist, Megria, stays back to collect the herbs he gathered. Early the next day, he tries to calculate how much he needs for the shop, but then a local carpenter named Gons shows up to ask for help because his son suddenly contracted a dangerous disease. Moments later, he joins a doctor to check what Tanta's symptoms are and realizes that he might get in trouble with the guild if they learn that he went into the woods to find herbs for the cure while Albert's party was there. However, after Gons begs him, he decides to do it regardless and makes sure no one can see him before he casually jumps over the town wall and uses a high-speed skill to run towards the forest. Once there, he tries to map it out, but the scent of burning trees suddenly catches his attention. So he runs in and sees that Albert's party used fire magic in the spot where the herb he needs for Tanta grows. To make matters worse, the same owlbear appears while he hurries to gather the remaining herbs. So he decides to not hold back and cuts right into its heart before running off to avoid contact with Albert. Later that night, he completes the cure at Gonza's place, and they all get excited as soon as the doctor notices that he is already getting better. After he promises to become a regular once Gideon opens the shop, Gons tries to offer him dinner, but he turns it down and tells him to focus on Tanta until he makes a full recovery. However, when Gons chases after him to offer anything he wants as a token of gratitude, Gideon decides to put his carpenter skills to good use and asks if he can build the shop he has been saving for. 4 months later, a hot adventurer named Rit walks into the guild and notices that Megria has a nice dress on, so she asks if there is a special occasion, and Megria explains that Gideon is throwing a party to celebrate the opening of his shop. Meanwhile, he has just thanked Gons and Tanta for their help building the shop and overhears the adventurers talking about how Rudy and the members of his previous party might soon defeat the Demon Lord. He then reminds himself that getting kicked out for being a weakling is all in the past and proceeds to make a toast for the shop. Days later, Gideon realizes that listening to Andrew Tate's speech about quitting his 9-to-5 was a stupid idea because not a single person has shown up to buy his drugs. Just then, someone walks in, causing him to get excited until he sees that it's just Rit. Moments later, he prepares a table to sit with her, and when she asks why everyone treats him like an NPC, he explains how he hides his powers to live a private life. She then gushes over the fact that he made it sound like her name, which means that he wanted to remember, and he resists the urge to say that no man would want to forget those massive milk jugs. After telling him that she left her country because some of her subjects wanted to start a fight to make sure she gets the throne instead of her brother, she asks why he suddenly vanished from the city. He then explains how Ares verbally assaulted him that night, and she loses it because he spent years making sure their party grew into what it currently is. But he claims it's no big deal since they all actually leveled up more than him. However, while making her a new cup of tea moments later, he thinks back to when he first started taking care of Rudy and convinces himself that she is better off without him. After he serves her the new cup, she acts like his cheap herb tea tastes better than the royal delicacies she was served growing up. But he tells her to stop the cap because he literally just poured hot water on some dried leaves he almost threw out. He then remembers that they first met one afternoon several years ago when his party showed up to her small country to discuss plans for a battle. While they were speaking, a bald creep tried to force himself on a chick, who then flicked him and threatened to chop his head off. After he ran off, Rit revealed herself to Gideon and told them all to leave because she doesn't need help from the hero's party to protect her people. However, just a couple of months after that, she was out in the woods forcing him to call her princess so she would share information on a scouting mission they were working on. After she told him about a shed up in the woods where a demon army was probably hiding supplies for the war, he suggested partnering with her country's army to take them down, but she refused and said she didn't want their soldiers answering to Rudy. During a strategy meeting days later, she brought up a plan to attack the demon army lodge and destroy all their supplies with a small unit, while her master Gaius would lead the main army into a battle against the demons to keep them distracted. Hours later, her plan had fallen apart because the demon army somehow knew that she would show up, and she struggled to understand how until Gaius revealed that he was actually a demon general that spent the last few days working with them after unaliving the real Gaius. Upon hearing this, Rit immediately tried to attack, but was forced down by an orc while the demon general explained how he would also morph into her body after murking her to take over her country. Luckily, Gideon showed up in time to save her, but they were both too weak to take down the demon general after he transformed, so Ruby showed up and chopped him to bits within seconds. Despite this, Rit was suddenly overcome by trauma as she stared at the terrified faces of her unalived comrades and holed up in her room for days until Gideon showed up to talk her out of it. Back in the shop, she suddenly asked to work for him, but his introvert instincts immediately kick in, so he tries to make the shop sound horrible and claims to be completely broke, but she still insists on working and eventually convinces him by bringing up the fact that he knows nothing about licensing his new drugs. Hours later, he serves dinner, and she falls in love with how good the food tastes, so he thanks her for the compliment. But when she starts asking a bunch of questions about what he needs to make the apartment look better, he gets suspicious and asks why she is making it sound like they are going to be roommates, and she immediately says she will be moving in with him.
Oh my God!
Around the same time, Ares brings in an assassin named Tis to see the rest of the party as Gideon's replacement, so Danon and Theodora introduce themselves to her before Rudy comes out from her tent to explain their current mission. The next day, Gideon wakes to Rit's perfect melons sleeping right beside him and rushes out to make breakfast so his intrusive thoughts won't take over.
Come on, man.
After finally dragging herself out of bed, she joins him at the table and asks if he actually has balls, because a real man would have kept her warm in bed. She then suggests going out to shop for a second bed and says she will probably get some high-priced paintings from the palace to make his shop look a lot more appealing. Upon seeing that he has no idea what she is saying, she explains how artwork affects the level of attention given to certain places before also reminding him that they need to visit the Zoltan Council to request approval for his new drug. While walking through town later that morning, she notices how peaceful they all are, and when she asks if it's always like this, he explains how being so far from the demon region makes Zoltan the safest town since they never experience any violence. Minutes later, they get to a mattress store run by an orc named Stormy, who nearly passes out from shock when Rit tells him that she moved in with Gideon. After he calmly shows her where to find the best beds, Gideon asks why he never speaks to him that way when he tries to shop. And Stormy responds by also asking why he would respond to a broke nobody who always tries to get half off on the cheapest items. Shortly after putting Gideon in his place, Stormy helps Rit pack all the light stuff into her pocket dimension and promises to send the rest over to the shop. So they both head out and Rit starts talking about how he probably spent a lot of time working on his crafting skills to reach such a level. After remembering that the only way to level up is by unaliving other people or creatures who have also received the blessing, Gideon gets upset before he hears someone's face getting cracked and sees a fat Uggo named Ademi beating Tanta up. He immediately rushes over to stop them and tells Ademi that he should fight demons if he is already this strong, but the plus-sized dingus throws a rock at him and runs away with his boy band. Gideon and Rit then help Tanta and his friend Al get cleaned up before asking about Ademi, because he is way too strong for his age. When they explain that he wasn't always violent, Gideon realizes that he probably received the Brawler's blessing and tells them that he probably has a high affinity for it, which would explain the high-level combinations he was practicing on Tanta. He further explains how having such a skill makes him more likely to go over to the dark side, and this causes Al to say that he doesn't want a blessing, but Tanta immediately tells him not to say it in front of anyone else. Upon learning that he actually has the weapon mastery blessing, Gideon explains that it will help him control any weapon with ease as long as he levels up with time, but Al gets upset and says he doesn't want it if it means growing up to be like Ademi. Both Rit and Gideon then take their time to explain that his blessing doesn't determine who he becomes in the future, and after Gideon offers to talk with him at the shop whenever he feels anxious, he gets excited again and thanks them before running off with Tanta. At the Zoltan Council hours later, they both get yelled at by a bald midget named Dan just for trying to market Gideon's drug. But after getting kicked out of his office, Rit tells Gideon not to worry because she knows someone else they can talk to. Moments later, they meet a man named Rudolph, who immediately recognizes Rit and explains that Dan recently came under heavy scrutiny for approving a drug that basically became magic meth to the locals. After he agrees to approve the drug simply because of his relationship with Rit, the lovebirds head out, and Gideon spends a couple minutes thanking her before they return home to discuss how successful his drug might become. When he tells her to keep her expectations low since it might take a while for the drug to take off, she suggests making something that people will immediately get hooked on, so he decides to make dinner for brain fuel. Just a couple minutes into eating, she asks why he hasn't considered selling food along with the drugs, so he tries to downplay how good he is. But then something suddenly clicks in his usually empty head. He immediately rushes into the lab and explains how bitter the average fever medicine is while literally turning it into an edible cookie. And as soon as her slow brain catches up, she decides to become his marketer. The next day, she spends hours outside the store handing out free samples to everyone, and by evening, they completely sell out. So Gideon casually twirls her around like a Barbie doll and expresses how grateful he is for all the help. Later that night, Dannon gets pissed at Ares for failing to gather any intel or negotiate with the desert locals, and after Ares claims that he did his best, Dannon tells him to admit that Gideon was the one reason they always completed their missions with ease. Ares immediately tries to make it sound like Gideon was actually useless, but that only pisses Dannon off even more. So he decides to go look for Gideon and says he would rather quit than continue with them. The next moment, Rudy comes out to ask if he really wants to go find Gideon, and after he shows respect and says yes, she gives him permission to leave. Minutes later, Dannon tells Theodora that Ares might have actually unalived Gideon and reminds her of a previous party member named Urandrala, who suspected it and had a fight with Ares when he told them Gideon had left. When Theodora asks why he never told Gideon how good he was back when he was still with them, Dannon reminds her that he has never been the type for small talk, but admits that he should have given Gideon the respect he deserves before heading out to find him. The next morning, Gideon wakes up to the same plotful scene.
Oh my.
But takes a little too long staring at Rit's smooth jugs until she wakes up. After, he joins her outside to clean up and remembers how he once dreamed of defeating the Demon Lord with Rudy and serving as the second in command to a squadron of knights. Minutes later, adventurers from the local guild enter the shop and struggle to believe their eyes upon seeing Rit working as an assistant, so they ask if he used some kind of charm on her. She then explains her perfectly rational decision to go from living in a castle as a princess to receiving less than minimum wage from a wannabe pharmacist. After Maya gets emotional and runs off, they both chase after her while Rit tells Gideon a special liquor she wants to try. When he asks if there is a special occasion she wants to celebrate, she nearly breaks character but tells him not to worry about it before heading out to shop for ingredients. A couple minutes later, Gideon receives another surprise visit from Albert, who then proceeds to ask why he would give up on becoming a world-famous adventurer just to make drugs in a rusty old town. Gideon then explains what personal preference means, since his brain clearly didn't reach maturity, but after claiming that he doesn't even care, Albert demands to know if he is the one that clapped the owlbear. Gideon quickly plays dumb and asks why he is even suggesting it, since everyone already knows it was him. But Albert refuses to believe him and explains that the cut they saw on the bear's chest looks similar to something his bronze sword can do. Despite this, Gideon still claims to be a lowly, deranked adventurer who could never even dream of something like that, so Albert decides to test him. As soon as he tries to stab him, Gideon drops to the ground and acts scared, so Albert admits that he actually wanted to offer him a spot in his party if he was actually that strong. The next moment, Rit rushes in and smashes Albert's ribs with a nasty kick that sends him crashing into the wall. She then tries to slice his head clean off for even trying to attack Gideon, but he stops her and explains that Albert was just looking for new party members. Rit then tells him to run off before she changes her mind, so Miss Alpha takes off to avoid another embarrassing beatdown. Just then, Rit returns to her usual state and asks Gideon why he always plays nice, so he tells her there was nothing to worry about because he would have fought back if things actually got serious, after also telling her that Albert is the only B-ranked adventurer, which makes him important to the town. He shows her the liquor she dropped in anger and suggests focusing on it instead. Hours later, she shares it with him for dinner and explains that she actually wanted to celebrate everything they have accomplished over the last few days. When she reminds him that they still have to get a bathtub, he promises to get it done with help from Gons before convincing her to try out his favorite sauna, since he would be going there tomorrow. The next day, he regrets even thinking about it because Gons and Stormy decided to challenge him to an endurance battle, as they both take turns calling him a wuss, since he hasn't even tried to get freaky with Rit. He decides to stop playing nice and drops the towel to show off his anaconda before turning up the heat until Gon's brain melts off. Moments later, a hot elf named Operera places a cold towel on his head to save what's left of it before they all ask Zeph why he doesn't have as many customers as usual. After he tells them about a new fancy sauna place that stole everyone's attention, they promise to stay loyal to him no matter what and order double rounds of beer to make sure he sells out what's left. However, back at the house a couple hours later, Rit and Operera try to figure something out to keep him in business. After they come up with a bunch of ideas and realize that the new spot will easily outdo him, Gideon serves them all a cup of tea, and Tanta immediately starts asking what herb he used this time. So he explains the recipe and suddenly gets an idea for Zeph. The next day, they head over to the sauna place to show him a bag of special herbs, and Gideon proceeds to explain how a primitive race of elves developed it to heal their bodies. Moments later, Zeph agrees that it actually feels good, but wonders if it will be enough to get his customers back, so Gideon tells him to wait and see. After soaking it in for a couple more seconds, Zeph finally starts to believe that it will work and thanks them all for the help before Gideon decides to enjoy his latest invention. When Rit and Operara suddenly walk in with nothing but towels covering their plot cannons, he tries to leave.
Why are you running?
But Rit forces him to stay and acts like it's no big deal. Operera then admits to being shocked that she chose him out of all the locals, but also commends her because she still hasn't met anyone as competent as him. As Rit also joins her to yap about how amazing he is, the heat merged with the effects of being so close to hotties vaporizes his last remaining brain cells, causing him to pass out in front of them.
Come on, man.
Days later, Zeph struggles to keep up with all the locals trying to experience the magic sauna, while Gideon and the guys start another contest until Operera walks in to yell at them and ends up seeing Stormy's green cakes after he passes out. Hours later, Gideon and Rit say goodbye to Gon's family before she suddenly tells him that she also bought liquor the other night because it is custom in her hometown for a couple to share it after their honeymoon. Despite knowing that they are nowhere close to that, Gideon decides to let her continue living in delusion, so they head home together. Meanwhile, Ares completely loses it back at the desert camp because they have still made no progress, so Theodora walks over to Tissa and promises that they were once a perfect party before wondering why Rudy didn't do anything when Gideon first left. Days later, Gideon hears someone knocking while setting up with Rit, so he goes to check it out and finds a squad of officials. When a man named Galantine orders him to bring Rit out, Gideon casually tells him to continue waiting in the sun until she decides to come and speak with them, so Galantine moves closer to scare him. However, Gideon stands on business with a soft smile to add the cherry on top. So Galantine realizes that getting an ugly scar only sounds tough in fantasy novels and agrees to wait for her. Gideon then heads back inside to tell Rit, and she decides to make them wait even longer just so she can charge up her social battery. When she finally heads out to hear them out, a messenger from the Thieves Guild walks in to meet Gideon and offers him an extremely valuable elven coin in exchange for dumping Rit. He also promises to get him an endless supply of thick baddies to please him, but Gideon turns down the offer and says Rit is worth way more than a coin capable of setting him up for life. Surprisingly, the messenger accepts his refusal without making a fuss and leaves just as Rit loses it due to the countless offers Galantine and the other officials have been making just to get her back as an adventurer. After saying that she has a lifelong contract to work in the shop and also promising to leave with Gideon if they manage to chase him out of town, she heads back inside and apologizes for being so loud. But Gideon tells her not to worry before giving her a special bracelet as down payment for the lifelong contract. When she tells him that such romantic gifts might give her the wrong idea of his intentions, he offers to get her another one instead of just admitting that he has always had unholy intentions from the moment he saw her.
Yeah, boy.
Meanwhile, the bald creep she beat up all those years ago has just arrived at the Thieves Guild for a meeting with Big Hawk, the guild master, who then tells him that Rit's retirement plan is also bad news for them. Naturally, the alopecia ambassador struggles to understand why her retirement would be bad news for a bunch of thieving works. So Big Hawk explains that without the regulation of the Adventurers Guild, Rit can just decide to take down his entire operation if she suddenly feels like it. He then promises Dur a full container of cash if he can get her back in the guild, and the bald creep assures him that it won't be an issue. Back at the shop, Rit gets all up in her feelings as she struggles to believe that she now lives with the guy she has been crushing on for years. A little while after the battle that traumatized her, they had to pass through a dangerous stretch of woods, as it was the only path the demon army didn't know about. But before starting the journey, Gideon invited Urandrala, who literally threw herself into him and made Rit feel stupid for even catching feelings. After he explained that her ability to communicate with the plants would help them navigate the woods, Rit got a lot more jealous as she realized that he trusted her a lot. But Gideon barely noticed this and simply focused on telling Danon and Theodora what they should work on. Around the same time, Ares had just hired Dur and other mercenaries from the Thieves Guild, but Gideon decided not to interfere, so they started heading into the woods, and Rit continued feeling jealous over how close Urandrala was clinging to Gideon. When he finally asked if she needed anything, she told him to mind his business, so he apologized for asking and kept it pushing. The next moment, Urandrala asked if she would be down to spend some time relaxing in a nearby river, and after she got her to say yes, Gideon suggested taking a break, and Ares immediately started arguing with him over it. Minutes later, Urandrala finally got her into the water and suddenly asked if she had feelings for Gideon, before saying that she would have a much better experience with him if she learns to communicate her feelings subtly instead of acting nonchalant whenever he tries to check on her. After thanking her for the advice, Rit then asked if she also had feelings for him, but Urandrala explained that she had long decided to stop getting into relationships with humans because her extremely long lifespan meant that they would all return to their ancestors before she could get past the honeymoon phase. She further explained how already having powers of her own means that she will obviously be the better match for him, since everyone else takes advantage of his abilities for their personal gain. Moments later, they continued the journey through the woods, but just as they were about to reach the exit, Urandrala stopped them and sensed demon scouts approaching. They all immediately knew that Dur sold intel on their mission to the demons, so Ares tried to give an excuse to make up for his incompetence. But Gideon told him to save it before asking Rudy and Rit if they could break through the horde of demons approaching. Rit immediately said it was too risky to pull off, but Rudy told her to trust his plan and asked Urandrala to go with him. Upon hearing this, Rit tried to stop him from leaving and said it was a bad idea, until Rudy told her to never question her orders again. Gideon then promised Rit that he would be okay, so she took off with Rudy and kept praying for his safety before they got close to the demon horde. Just then, Rudy told her to stand back, and as usual, she tried to argue about it, but Rudy ignored her and proceeded to cut down the entire horde in minutes, causing Rit to realize that she wasn't even strong enough to serve as a backup. When Gideon and Urandrala finally got back, she got emotional and tried to hug him, but Rudy grabbed him first and apologized for sending him off on his own. This caused Rit to realize how close they were to each other, so she decided to continue her journey alone afterwards, which is how she eventually ended up in Zoltan. With her trip down memory lane complete, she heads out to make a delivery, and Dur uses that opportunity to talk to her, but she refuses and turns to leave. However, when he claims to know that she is a princess and threatens to tell her people where she is, she knocks him down for speaking to her disrespectfully and says she doesn't care about her social status anymore. Later that night, Rudy struggles to fall asleep as she continues to miss Gideon and thinks back to the day Ares told her that he left. After claiming that he tried everything to stop Gideon, he grabbed her shoulder to offer support, but she could sense that he was behind it and suddenly punched a hole through his insides. Luckily, she held herself back and fixed him before deciding to focus on her mission as the hero destined to save all of humanity. At Dr. Newman's place several days later, Gideon brings over a whole basket of drugs. But while explaining how one last herb went out of season, they both hear a loud scream and crashing from one of the houses nearby and rush out to figure out what happened. Moments later, Newman leads him into a house where they find a man named Jackson on the floor overdosed and immediately try to revive him. However, upon realizing that he has never seen such a reaction before, he struggles with the next course of action until Gideon gives him a blue medicine and explains its effects. After spotting a drug that looks a lot similar to nose candy, Gideon helps him carry the man back to the clinic, and after making sure he is stabilized, Newman tells him to prepare more bottles of the blue medicine because the drug they saw is the recently approved one everyone has been taking. Shortly after their conversation, Gideon returns to the store and sees Rit, who has been waiting all day for his cooking, so he quickly whips up some omelette rice before telling her everything. When she asks if they should look into the drug, he tells her not to bother since it has nothing to do with them and suggests going out to enjoy some attractions in town instead. Later on, they rent drakes and spend most of the day riding across town before finding a river to spend some time. As Gideon sets up the tent, Rit decides that it's the perfect time to show him what she is working with, but the sight of her plot cannons causes him to get delirious, so he turns away to avoid temptation. After several minutes of splashing around in the water, their date takes an awkward turn as they both struggle to come up with a conversation topic while grilling the food. When Gideon finally says that he expected her to be a lot less shy considering the fact that she wasted no time to move into his place, she admits that it was a bit daring but explains that she still feels shy around him because he barely shows how he really feels. He then takes her hand and says he just didn't want to come off as a desperate creep, and she responds by finally giving him the kiss he has been craving this entire time. Meanwhile, Ares has just brought Rudy and the rest of the party to a desert ruin from the time of the previous demon lord, and after he yaps about how they don't need Danon or Gideon, Tissa decides to go get some extra water for the rest of the trip. Just as she starts filling up the bottle, Rudy shows up to feel the water, so Tissa takes that opportunity to ask if she ever sleeps because she always stays up through the night. Rudy then explains that her blessing essentially makes her a human android with zero weaknesses who never needs to eat or sleep and can only focus on her mission to save the world as humanity's hero. While Tissa starts to realize why she could never go after Gideon, he and Rit have just returned to the shop, and upon realizing that they barely have anything left to do, she asks if there have been any more requests for the magic meth's antidote. After he says there's almost no one complaining about it. She explains how some of the locals claimed it was capable of altering their personalities to make them a completely different person. Just then, an injured local runs inside and begs for help, so Gideon immediately starts treating him while Rit runs into town and finds several wounded folks before seeing Campbell, a member of Albert's party. Upon seeing the axe in his hand, she wonders how someone with the thief's blessing knows how to use a weapon, but then a couple more psychos surround her, so she starts fighting until Albert reunites them with God. When she asks if it was really necessary to shoot arrows into their clearly scrambled heads, he asks why her wannabe pharmacist fiancé didn't show up and immediately regrets it as she points her knives towards him. Luckily, she drops them and takes a moment to get her emotions under control before returning to the shop to tell Gideon about it. Just as he also tries to figure out how Campbell, who was a usually chill dude, suddenly became so strong, Tanta and Al show up to talk with them, so Gideon decides to make lunch for everyone. Shortly after this, he serves them a plate of pasta, and Rit immediately swallows a whole serving just so she can ask him for more. Minutes later, Al tells him about his blessings again because he recently started feeling extremely anxious, so Gideon explains how stressful it can be in the beginning, especially because he hasn't chosen a weapon to master yet. When Al asks why he can't just be a regular warrior like his dad and tend to cargo at the docks, Gideon suggests starting out by mastering a small knife so he can help them out at the docks until he feels strong enough to decide on which weapon he wants to master. Later that day, a chick named Rhea shows up at the shop to talk and reminds Gideon that she is a member of Albert's party before apologizing to the both of them on his behalf. When Rit asks what he is up to, she explains how he started taking up more quests than usual to make up for the slow months they have been having, despite all the tragedy that happened recently. After Rit expresses shock over the fact that he wants them to return to work like nothing happened, Gideon explains how his champion blessing drives him to achieve crazy feats and makes it difficult for him to settle into a regular life. Rhea then admits to being scared that he might get fed up and leave Zoltan, but Gideon tells her not to worry because he is way too desperate to become the town's best adventurer. Meanwhile, Dannon, who has just finished getting a drink somewhere in town, receives a surprise visit from a man named Bui, who then asks to join his search for Gideon. Hours later, Rit shuts all the windows at the shop and joins Gideon inside to drink warm milk. She then asks if he has any idea what Rudy and the others have been up to, so he tells her all about Rudy's recent takedowns and says they don't have to worry about her. However, the storm causes him to remember a similar night years ago when they both had to stay in a shelter to wait out an even stronger storm. While sitting together, he held her hand and taught her about the true meaning of love and kindness, so she gave him a hug and asked if he would stay with her forever. He then said they would have to stay apart for a while since he had to train and become strong, but promised to always show up if she ever needed anything. The next moment, his wholesome trip down memory lane gets interrupted by a knock on the door, so he rushes out and sees Newman carrying a heavily wounded Al on his back. Minutes later, he wakes up in Gideon's bed and starts screaming before telling them that a dummy came to his place with an axe and attacked his parents. Upon hearing this, Gideon and Newman rush down to his house and find his parents unconscious, but thankfully they only sustained minor injuries. However, the following day, every local in the area starts a protest against the town guard, as they believe that a man named Moan, who happens to be Ademi's father and captain of the guards, is trying to protect him. As tensions continue to rise, Elle's parents take shelter in Big Hawk's mansion while he moves in with Gideon and Rit. While having lunch with them the following day, he suddenly asks Rit to teach him how to use a sword, so she spends most of the day sparring with him before getting coffee and joining Gideon on the porch. After talking about how easy it was to teach all the basics, she tells Gideon about her master and all the lessons she learned about fighting before asking if she can actually do the same for all. Gideon then tells her to believe in herself a little more, and just as she grabs his hand to thank him, Gon shows up with Now to tell them that the town guards suddenly took Tanta away. After they explain how the guards refused to let Mito or anyone else see him, Gideon takes everyone to Galantine's office to ask for a letter requesting a joint inquiry with the guards. Seeing as he has been trying to get Rit back, Galantine agrees to it and signs off on the letter, so Gideon immediately takes it over to the guards, who then recognize Rit and run inside to inform Moan. Moments later, they all enter his office, and after reuniting with Tanta, Mito tells Moan to skip all the small talk so they can figure out what the hell is going on. He then starts by explaining how some of the guards said Al's people might have lied to Demi, and when Gideon explains what he allegedly did to Al's parents, Moan suggests that they might be wrong about it. Al immediately blows up in his face and claims it was definitely a Demi, so Moan further explains that he is just trying to get to the bottom of things because it makes no sense for a Demi to suddenly attack his folks with an axe and only cause minor injuries. The next moment, Tanta also says that it might not be a Demi because he suddenly showed up to apologize several days before the incident and mentioned something about struggling with his blessing before promising to get better so he could fulfill his dream of protecting everyone as a part of the town guard. As they all try to wrap their heads around this new information, Moan asks Gideon for some time to talk, so he asks Mito to take Al back to the shop while he and Rit stay back to hear Moan out. After he offers to compensate them if they help the investigation, Gideon asks if Ademi ever took the magic meth. All of a sudden, Moan flips out and claims his son would never resort to that, but Gideon tells him to try being a little realistic because they all already know that the drug alters a person's character, while Moan also drops a bomb by telling them that it can change a person's blessing. Mito and Tanta drop all at the shop and leave before a man named Godwin walks in to see him. Later on, Gideon returns and offers to help Al train since Rit won't be back for a while, so Al grabs his sword. When Gideon picks up a broom, Al gets surprised and charges in to prove his strength, only to get flipped over in seconds. He then explains how important it is to master the basics of combat as a beginner, and goes on to spend the entire day schooling him until they both run out of breath. When Al asks why he is still just a deranged adventurer despite having so much skill and experience, Gideon explains his love for the simple things and says he would continue living the way he currently is rather than obsess over some great accomplishment. After giving it some thought, Al then tells him about how Godwin gave him a valuable sword and kept talking about all the things he could achieve as a weapons master if he locks in. He goes on to say that Rit is a big part of the reason he now wants to become stronger, but also admits that his blessing might still be influencing his thoughts. To help him feel better, Gideon tells him some of the advice he received from Theodora and once again reminds him to trust his gut. Meanwhile, Rit has just thrown a drug dealer off a roof, but as she tries to interrogate him, he starts drooling over her cakes, so she steps back before he suddenly explodes. The next moment, she gets surrounded by a group of thugs and realizes that she can't pull out her sword in time. But thankfully, Danon shows up to help. After knocking them all out, he tells her about his mission to get Gideon back, but says he might reconsider because of the life they are building together. He then tries to get a close look at one of the thugs and sees that he is actually a stalker demon, so he promises to help Rit with whatever's going on, but she can't tell Gideon that he is in town. After, she gets back home and immediately pounces on Gideon before listening to how he spent the day training Al. As she then stuffs her face with a sandwich he made, he shows her the sword Al received and asks if she can figure out what kind of magic was used on it. After a couple of seconds of reading into the energy trapped in the sword, she tells him that a tracking spell was inscribed into it. The next morning, they both take Al to see a smith named Mogren, but as he starts showing Al around, Gideon hears some noise outside and goes to check it out. After listening to the protesters, he spots Maya and Kaith, who then explain how the town guard has been too busy dealing with multiple protests to properly investigate the recent attacks. Just then, they see Oliver supporting the protesters, so Kaith and Maya beg Gideon to talk some sense into him. Meanwhile, Rudy and the others have just entered the ruins containing the previous demon lord's weapon, but when they run into a colossal demon, Theodora sends Tissa to look for the weapon so they can focus on defeating it. As soon as she leaves, Rudy gets as close as possible just to satisfy her curiosity with the demon, and after she introduces herself with a painful slice across its face, Theodora charges in with her spear to hold it back. Ares, on the other hand, nearly goes number 2 as the fear paralyzes him, but Rudy holds the demon's sword in place and combines her attack with Theodora to take it down. She then tells Ares not to expect them to be his babysitters because Gideon was the one responsible for defending him when he was still in the party. Despite realizing his mistake, Ares convinces himself that it's all Danon and Eurandrala's fault before Tissa shows them the weapon, which turns out to be a gunship. A couple of minutes after they take off, Tissa asks Rudy if there is anywhere in particular she wants to go, but Rudy reminds her that her only choice is to follow the path of destiny. That night, Gideon and Rit finally get their king-sized bed from Stormy, so he climbs in with her for a cuddle session. But they both decide to take their relationship to the next step. However, just as Gideon starts revealing her golden globes, they hear someone tiptoeing across the hallway and realize that Al is probably sneaking down to get water on his own to avoid causing them any stress. To make sure he doesn't hear them making unholy sounds, Gideon decides to reschedule their bedroom workout for another night. The following day, Rit sneaks into town with a cloak and quickly gets surrounded by Dur and some goons who think she is Al. As soon as she drops the cloak and reveals that she took the sword to figure out who was tracking Al, they all attack her, but she easily puts them all to sleep before one last goon transforms into an axe demon. Back at the shop, Al hears someone knocking at the door and tells the knight watching him that it's probably Godwin again, but the knight ignores his warnings and opens the door. Godwin then tells him that they have an important mission with Big Hawk, and when Al tries to fight back, a mysterious thug grabs his arm. Shortly after this, they throw him in front of Big Hawk, who then reminds him that all non-human species in Zoltan have always been treated like outcasts. He goes on to explain how unfair it is that they have to deal with the lifestyle forced on them by their blessings, and says he created a solution with the magic meth. Upon seeing the intrigued look on Al's face, Big Hawk then admits that he is the one behind everything and explains how he made the drug from the hearts of 50 axe demons just so that he could receive a new gift and carve a new destiny for himself. After saying that his new mission is to take over Zoltan, he asks Al for his assistance before telling the guards to bring Ademi, who then apologizes for the attack and says he only took the drug to become a better guard. Minutes later, they all go out to the balcony, and Al watches as Big Hawk addresses his slow-brained fans, who all apparently believe that the town's most notorious thief is on their side. After forcing two fake knights to spin a lie about how they worked with Moan to keep Ademi hidden, he hands Al a knife and tells him to spark their revolution by sending his former pal to the great beyond. When Al asks why he isn't taking accountability for giving Ademi the drug in the first place, Big Hawk admits that they gave him the drug and axe as well, but claims that it makes no difference since Ademi attacked his family all on his own. He also reminds Al that unaliving someone with a slightly higher blessing will make him stronger, so Al walks over to Ademi but cuts off the rope instead of his head. Just then, Godwin pulls out an axe and explains how merely looking at it will trigger a murderous intent in Ademi, so Al prepares himself for a fight. However, as soon as Ademi grabs the axe, Gideon cuts it in half and knocks Godwin out before grabbing the boys and taking off. Moments later, he gives Ademi a potion to suppress his violent urges and makes them promise not to tell a soul about it since the church considers it unholy. When Boy suddenly shows up, Gideon reminds him of the plan they came up with and sends him off with the boys before heading out to see Big Hawk and Albert, who had been searching the entire town for him. Upon seeing him, Albert charges in to attack, but Gideon easily counters every strike and pushes him back. Albert then realizes that what happened at the shop was all an act and wonders how he is so strong. But Gideon ignores him because he just realized that the demon sword he is using means he forged a contract. The next moment, a demon named Belial reveals himself and explains that he took over Big Hawk's body because he was too desperate to become the king of Zoltan. However, seeing as the people of Zoltan were too lazy and slow to help him achieve his goals sooner, he made a contract with Albert as well. When Gideon asks Albert if he really turned a blind eye to all the recent attacks because of his desire to get stronger, Albert claims that it was necessary to unite the people so they could all join Rudy's fight against the Demon Lord. After revealing his dream to join Rudy's party and make his mark in the history books, he tells Gideon to choose between joining forces with him or having an epic duel to the death. However, when knights from the town guard suddenly surround him, Gideon reminds him that he has never been desperate for validation or accomplishments. Upon hearing this, Albert refuses to accept that he will be arrested like the average thug, so he tries to attack Gideon, only to get his hand chopped off. The next moment, he starts bawling his eyes out as the painful reality that Gideon was always stronger finally hits. Sensing the pain in his voice, Gideon admits that he wanted him to become the town's hero because no one else had worked as hard as him to achieve that goal. Meanwhile, Ademi and Al have just made it to Big Hawk's mansion, where all the locals are still gathered, and after Bui lifts them off the ground with flight magic, they both explain everything that happened and assure everyone that there is no need to fight since they already made up. Later that night, Gideon and Rit take a dip in their new bath, and when she moves closer to see if he is ready for the honeymoon phase, he matches her freak but decides to spend the night explaining how much he loves her instead of demonstrating it with his magnum. At the town's prison a little while later, Bui suddenly shows up to see Belial, who then realizes that he is actually Shinsandan. After quickly grabbing his throat to keep him from blabbing, Shinsandan asks why he would introduce humans to Devil's Blessing, the magic meth he used to brainwash Ademi. Belial then says he did it because of his hatred for the Demon Lord and breaks out of his cell before tracking Albert down and getting him to agree to a new contract. The following day, Gideon and Rit go to see Al off, as he has managed to start a party of his own to get stronger. By sundown that same day, Belial and Albert make it to Rudy's camp in the desert to share a proposal. Early the next day, Ayers freezes in shock upon seeing the airship far off into the clouds, so he asks Theodora if someone stole it while they were sleeping. When she tells him that Tiss and Rudy ditched them, he freaks out and asks how they can possibly survive without his magic. But she tells him to worry about himself and heads inside. Just then, Tiss realizes that she has gone from being a feared assassin to a boat driver, so she asks Rudy why they are going to Zoltan, after saying that she needs to get more doses of an important drug. Rudy thinks back to the previous night when Belial swore that he was on her side and explained how the magic meth could reduce the effects of her blessings and help her level up by clapping any enemy regardless of their level. When she suddenly poured half the entire bag down her throat, Belial nearly lost bladder control because he left out a couple of details, but as usual, she was perfectly fine. Back on the airship, she has just asked Tiss to become her travel buddy and explains her plan to blend in as a commoner. But Tiss gets confused and asks why she chose her instead of Theodora or Ares. So Rudy says it's because she is the only one that stays calm around her despite the fact that she is incredibly powerful. As Tiss then focuses on getting to Zoltan as quickly as possible, Gideon gets fed up with the way business has been slow over the last few days. So Rit brings him a cup of hot chocolate and explains how the locals barely come out during winter. However, seeing as they still need to make some kind of income, Gideon brainstorms to create a new product. But Rit ends up with the idea for once and tells him about a hand warmer she used in the palace during winter. Later on, Gideon takes a sample to Gons, and after an entire day of making sure that everyone has tried it, he meets up with Rit on the way home. They then find a bench to sit on, and after making sure no one else can see, Gideon steals a kiss to keep warm. Early the next day, Rudy and Tiss park the airship somewhere in the woods, but after changing into regular people's clothes, Rudy hands Tiss her sword and runs off into the woods to get a weaker one from a Goblin village. Shortly after that, they get to the bridge, but a man named Otto stops them to demand payment, so Rudy yeets him into the river to clear a path for everyone else. Shortly after this, Gideon arrives at the same bridge, so Otto tries to redeem his honor by challenging him, only to get punched out of the solar system. Hours later, Rudy carries a colossal woodland monster to the town's gate and explains how dangerous it would have been if she let it roam freely. To avoid any extra attention, Tiss suggests finding an inn to spend the night, and after getting Rudy inside, she heads out to scout the town and finds a restaurant to have dinner. On getting there, she places her order, and Gideon, who had arrived a couple minutes earlier, asks Operera for a stool to boost the nonchalant Nidget. He then takes a good look at her and realizes that she is definitely a professional of some kind, but she does the exact same thing and quickly asks for a to-go bag to avoid a confrontation. Back at the inn minutes later, she tells Rudy that they have to be extremely careful with Godwin's prison break plan because people like Gideon might try to stop them. The next day, Rudy heads over to the prison to gather information, and after thinking about what Gideon would likely tell her to do in the situation, she starts missing him even more and decides to stop at nothing to see him again. Meanwhile, he and Rit have just received a surprise visit from a fairy dragon who then takes them to the Fey village to see a sick but hot magical baddie known as an Archfey. After checking her symptoms, Gideon explains that she is feeling the effects of a curse that drains magical energy, but Rit gets confused since an Archfey should be the creature with the most magic in the area. Later that night, Rudy and Tiss break into Godwin's cell, and he initially tries to put up a tough act. But after Rudy tells him to make more devil's blessings with her usual expression, he promises to do whatever she wants, so she takes him to an empty warehouse at the docks. The next morning, she decides to get his drugs since she can't expose herself by using her healing abilities, so Tiss tells her about a drugstore everyone seems to love and suggests getting from there. Later that morning, Gon shows up at the shop to get more hand warmers and tells Gideon about the prison break. But then Rudy walks in with Tiss and Brake's character for the first time in ages before hugging him. After a couple more minutes of embracing, Gons leaves and Gideon assures them that he won't be asking a question about them before Tiss introduces herself. When they ask if he lives alone, Gideon reminds Rudy of the time they worked with Rit to see if she remembers, but she skips the long talk to tell everything that has happened since he left the party. She then asks him to join them again and promises to make sure Ayers can no longer speak to him disrespectfully. But Gideon turns her down and explains that he has already built an amazing life, so Rudy decides to move to Zoltan as well. Just then, Rit returns and freezes in shock the moment she sees Rudy, so Gideon quickly whips up more tea to ease the tension. He then asks Rudy why she even came to Zoltan, so she tells him about her mission to find a certain someone before saying that she has mostly been looking for him because they can't defeat the demon lord without his help. Upon hearing this, Rit asks for his plans, but he tells her not to worry about him leaving, and Rudy also assures her that there won't be a problem since she will also be moving to Zoltan. She then gets up to leave and only tells Gideon that she has important business to attend to, so he reminds her to stop by if she ever needs anything before rubbing her head. On the way back to the inn moments later, Rudy tries to take in the joy of finally finding him again, but the effect of her blessings suddenly kicks in, so she quickly swallows another dose of Devil's blessings to keep it under control. Later on, Rit meets Gideon at a bridge and asks for his thoughts on Rudy's decision to stay close to him instead of focusing on the mission. So he explains how her destiny as the hero has made it almost impossible for her to experience a normal life. Later that night, Tish checks up on Godwin and explains that they will be staying in Zoltan for a little while longer, but he immediately asks to be taken away from town because the town guard will definitely send him to the great beyond if they find him. Shortly after that, she returns to the inn and tells Rudy, who then decides to spend the next couple of days finding him a secret hideout so he can start making the drug. When Rudy suddenly stands up and approaches Tish, her spider tries to tell her something, but she misunderstands and draws her sword to defend herself. Upon seeing this, Rudy apologizes and says she would never want to harm them. This causes Tish to realize that she has never actually treated Rudy like a regular girl. So she apologizes for jumping to conclusions and introduces her to the spider. At Gideon's shop the following day, Rudy's death stare ends up becoming more of a problem than they all expected. So Gideon decides to take her into town while Tish stays back to watch the shop with Rit. Minutes later, they arrive at Zeph's sauna place. But after greeting Gideon, he takes one look at Rudy and almost gets a heart attack. However, he quickly composes himself and promises to mind his business before apologizing for acting like she is a scarecrow. Moments later, all the chicks in the sauna watch in shock as she walks in without a towel and casually sits on the steaming hot chair. After, she joins Gideon for a bottle of warm milk before all the locals surround them to talk about how amazing she looks. On the way home later on, she apologizes to him for standing out, but then he admits that it felt good to show her off to everyone and decides to take her to the market instead of going straight home. Meanwhile, in a boat somewhere across the ocean, Ares completely loses his sanity as he desperately tries to track Rudy down. So Theodora wakes Albert up so she can have a conversation with someone who still has half his senses intact. When she promises to get him a prosthetic hand at their next stop, he tells her about a certain someone that never seemed to care about becoming a legend with his blessing. She then explains that having a blessing doesn't mean one must pursue validation and fame, causing him to slowly understand what Gideon spent months trying to tell him. At the shop a couple of hours later, Gideon serves the girls his signature honey milk, and after he gives some sugar water to Tiss's spiders, Rudy suddenly asks to take a bath with Rit. As soon as she says yes, Tiss asks to join them and shows off a diary she uses to review every bath she has ever taken. Moments later, she tries to enjoy the warm water but quickly remembers that she has to be on guard since Rudy might decide to send Rit to the other side for getting freaky with her brother. Thankfully, Rit breaks the ice by asking her what he was like when they were younger. And after saying that he has always been the same, Rudy tells them about the first time she fought against a monster. Despite having no experience, she had no choice but to obey her destiny as the hero, but the owl bear quickly overpowered her. Upon realizing that she was way too weak to survive the fight, she accepted her fate and actually felt a little relieved since she would no longer have to deal with everyone calling her a weirdo anymore. Luckily, Gideon finally showed up and sliced the owl bear in half before hugging her and apologizing for taking so long. After the trip down memory lane, she starts explaining how her powers make it impossible for her to feel even the warmth of the water and every normal thing they get to experience as humans. When she also tells Rit that the reason she always seemed upset with her back then was because she was jealous of how easily she could express herself, Rit and Tiss get emotional and decide to help her feel human no matter the cost. After breakfast the following day, Gideon thanks Tiss for looking after Rudy all this time, and his calm demeanor causes her to realize why Rudy trusts him so much. So she decides to give him the full story about Godwin and the devil's blessing. Upon hearing that Rudy has been taking it to reduce the effects of her blessings, Gideon tells them that it might get to the point where she no longer has any poison immunity and suggests going to ask Godwin for more details about the drug. After thanking him for being so considerate, Tiss tells Gideon not to make Rudy feel like she made a mistake by choosing herself for once, but he assures her that he will only do what makes her happy. Tiss then says she has to get supplies for Godwin at the docks, but he offers to get it for her since he knows all the best shops. So Rit decides to go hire some drakes so she and Tiss can start heading to the old elven ruin where Rudy is keeping Godwin. Later that morning, Albert, Theodora, and Ares make it into town, but when she suggests getting an inn close to the docks for access to more information, Ares refuses and ditches them to find a better place close to the center of town. Around the same time, Gideon finds a shop for Godwin's supplies and almost faints from shock when Dannon suddenly shows up with one arm missing. As they quickly find a restaurant to catch up, Theodora uses a cloaking spell to keep herself and Albert hidden so they can listen to their conversation. Dannon then tells Gideon all about how miserable they have been since he left and asks him to return. But Gideon tells him the same thing he has told everyone else before revealing that Rudy is also in town. After he also explains her current situation, Dannon reminds him that he has never had enough brain power to process complicated information, but promises to fight alongside Ruti regardless of what she chooses to do with her blessings. As he gets back up to go help her, Gideon asks what happened to his arm, but he acts like it's no big deal while Theodora and Albert contemplate revealing themselves. By then, Ayres has already settled into an inn, but then he receives a surprise visit from a second Dannon who somehow has both arms intact. Due to having a brain the size of a walnut, Ayres ignores the obvious and starts asking questions about Gideon. So Dannon explains his new life with Rit at the shop. The fact that Gideon still managed to get with a royal baddie like Rit causes Ayres to flip out, and his anger only increases upon realizing that Ruby is probably also trying to reunite with him. Minutes later, they both get to the shop, and Ayres immediately starts thrashing the place, but after going as far as tearing up the bed, his anger triples. So he orders Dannon to help him find them without realizing that he is being played. Meanwhile, Gideon has just stopped running with Dannon because he just explained how Shin-Sandin attacked him on his way to Zoltan and bit off his arm. When Gideon asks how he could have survived after stabbing his heart, Dannon tells him not to worry because they can always defeat him again. Just then, they see a spirit drake flying towards the ruins, so Dannon tells Gideon to run ahead since he is a lot faster. Moments later, he catches up to the girls and explains what happened to Dannon, but Rit gets shocked and blames herself for not telling him sooner because he would have easily seen through Shin-Sandin's lies. After he tells her to focus on the fact that they will have to fight him again, she tells him not to worry because she has been dreaming of revenge since that day. She then tells him to go ahead, so he takes off again and runs past Ayres before getting to the ruins. While walking through it, he struggles to believe that such a structure exists in their world and eventually makes it to the lab Rudy placed Godwin in. Upon seeing the one-eyed creep, he twists his arm to force him to yell, and Rudy immediately crashes in through the wall to attack. However, after seeing that it's just him, she leads him into the deeper parts of the facility before he reveals that he has actually been looking for ways to suppress her blessing. After he shows her one of the potions he made to suppress her powers, she gets surprised and says she always thought he only trained and got stronger so he could protect humanity and become a legendary knight. He then says that all he ever wanted was to protect her and be strong enough to offer support whenever she needed it. So she asks if her current plan to ditch Destiny is something he can stand by. This causes him to realize that she still hasn't seen the full picture. So he explains that her happiness is the most important thing to him. While they both take a moment to embrace, Ayres gets fed up with Shin-Sandin for not knowing exactly where they are going. But after a couple more minutes of listening to his rants, Shin-Sandin decides to stop teasing and tells him where the ruins are. At the same time, Dannon suddenly stops running the moment Theodora lands on a spirit drake with Albert. Back in the ruins, Rudy and Gideon have just met up with the girls, and after Rudy thanks Tis for telling them everything, Gideon reminds them that they need to learn how the Devil's Blessing uses the Heart of Demons to suppress Rudy's blessing. When she suddenly reveals that the demon hearts had no effect on her, Gideon asks how she suppresses her abilities, so she explains how a nameless blessing activates whenever she takes the drug. In the lab minutes later, Godwin claims to have no idea of what a nameless blessing is, and when Gideon asks if it can give her murderous urges, he explains that she should not feel a sudden change in her personality since it doesn't manifest any new abilities. The next moment, Tis senses an attack, so they rush out and see a wave of plague eyes used by mages to find their targets. After blowing it up, Rudy takes off to find the spellcaster, so Gideon tells Rit to protect Godwin and chases after her. As soon as they run into Ayres, he asks Rudy to leave with him and fulfill her destiny by defeating the Demon Lord. But she refuses and tells him that she no longer plans to be the hero. When he ignores her wishes to remind her of the importance of being a hero, Gideon tries to talk some sense into him, but he responds by blasting him into the wall. The next moment, Rudy stabs into his guts and tells him to be grateful that she chose to miss his vital organs. She then heals Gideon and tells Ayres to forget about his dreams of working with her before leaving. Just then, Shin-Sandin switches back to Bowie and tries to give him a potion, but Ayres heals himself and tells him to drop the act because he can already sense the demonic aura. Upon hearing this, Shizanden offers a temporary partnership and promises to help him find an old relic that belonged to the first hero. After he claims that it will help him reunite with Rudy to fulfill his dream, Ares foolishly agrees to it. While heading towards a deeper level moments later, he remembers the first time he saw Rudy and became obsessed with saving the world at her side. Meanwhile, Gideon has just told the rest of the gang about him, and after Tiss uses her aura sensing abilities to pick up Shinsanden's life force, they all run off to stop them. Around the same time, Danon makes it inside the ruins with Albert and Theodora, who then asks if he is ready for what might happen when they find Ares and Rudy. When he tells her to get to the point if she has something to say, she tells him to focus on doing what he does best when the time comes. The next moment, he breaks open the elevator and jumps all the way to the floor Ares entered before throwing a sword at Shinsanden. After blocking it, he charges in with the hope that Danon's current disability will serve as an advantage, but Danon easily evades his attack and turns his head into a soccer ball with a powerful punch. He then thanks him for biting off his weak left arm and proceeds to pound him into the wall with a flurry of punches. When Shinsanden starts asking for help, Ares initially stops himself from attacking his own party member, but after a couple more seconds of thinking, he zaps Danon. Upon seeing this, Shinsanden immediately stabs him in the gut and rigs the tip of his sword to explode. But Danon remains on his feet and motions for a second round. After acknowledging his strength, Shinsanden returns to his original form to gain the upper hand, but Danon blocks all 6 of his swords with 2 fingers until they shatter against his touch. However, Shinsanden manages to lodge one of the blades into his gut, so Danon admits defeat and drops. Ares then wonders how he so easily betrayed him, but after thinking back on how he spent so much time plotting against Gideon just because of how close he was with Rudy, he accepts his darkness and follows Shinsanden into the Chamber of Relics. Using a series of special codes, Shinsanden cracks into a golden case that holds the sacred swords, but Ares gets confused and asks how it's possible because there should be only one in existence. Shinsanden then explains that unlike the hero sword Rudy uses in battle, these ones are the true swords of legend from the time of the first hero. He further explains that the only way to get Rudy back is to unilug Gideon and make sure she holds the sword to amplify her blessing. Moments later, Gideon and the girls find the Chamber of Relics and prepare for a fight, but then Shinsanden comes out first with Gaius' body, so Rit immediately attacks him. As soon as Gideon tries to help her, Ares summons a fiery flame to burn them up, so they focus on evading until Rudy creates shields to protect them. She then offers to forgive Ares if he stops acting insane, but he responds by channeling his abilities to create a dark spear, so she counters with a spell of her own and almost destroys the entire floor. As Tiss runs over to protect Godwin, Ares tries to pull out the sacred sword, but Rudy suddenly unleashes a powerful whirlwind that forces everyone back and shatters the sword. Just as Shinsanden realizes that she is far beyond the level of any of the past heroes, Tiss senses something about to climb in from a lower level, so she tells Rit to jump out of the way. Just then, Theodora shatters the ground as she jumps in and wraps Rit up in chains before attacking Rudy. Rudy immediately asks why, so she reminds her that the world needs a hero and says she is ready to sacrifice her even if it's not the right thing to do. Rudy then explains that she never wanted this power, but Theodora refuses to listen and says they have to obey the will of God by following destiny. After escaping the claws of her spirit Drake, Rit reminds her that Rudy was never alone during all their missions and says that she will never accept such a cruel fate, even if it means going against God. Upon hearing this, Shinsanden admits that he would have loved to work with her if they weren't sworn enemies. Just then, the spirit Drake tries to attack her again, so Gideon rushes into the elevator and claps it, but Ares immediately uses an iron boulder to snap the lines. The next moment, Rudy slices Theodora's spear in half and tries to chase after them, but Shinsanden stops her, and they both blast into the lower levels to continue fighting. Right then, Ares attacks Tiss and becomes convinced that no one can stop him, so Godwin decides to stop hiding and throws a fog-producing device to distract him. However, he gets dropped in an instant, but after Ares also stomps on Tiss's spider, Danon uses the last of his energy to shoot Gideon and Rit back to Ares. Upon seeing them, he loses it and tries to attack again. But this time, Gideon decides to stop playing nice and chops his hands off before landing a fatal strike that sends him up to the clouds. By then, Shinsanden has just gotten back on his feet, but before fighting Rudy, he drops one of the sacred swords and starts yapping about her destiny until she loses it and decides to murk him at all costs. In a fit of rage, she grabs the sacred sword and takes off his head, but it suddenly amplifies her blessing to the point where her humanity completely fades away. The moment she gets back up, Gideon tries to check on her, but she suddenly charges in. So Tis jumps in front of him and receives a brutal cut across her chest. Godwin immediately tells Gideon that she might have finally gotten the murderous urges from the devil's blessing, so he hands Tis over to Rit and pulls out his sword to fight her. Moments later, she starts overpowering him and cracks his sword, so he drops it and decides to use the weaker one. Upon seeing this, Godwin asks if he has lost his mind, but Gideon waits until she slices into the sword before twisting the sacred sword out of her grip. As the mind control wears off, she runs into his arms and starts crying right before Dannon and Albert show up. Just then, Rit tells them that her healing abilities are not working on Tis, so Rudy rushes over and panics when she notices that her powers are no longer working. Thankfully, Theodora uses her regeneration magic to heal her and immediately tells Rudy that she doesn't regret what she did. After Rudy reminds her that Gideon could have been clapped, she still insists that she would have done the exact same thing all over again to ensure the safety of all humanity. She then asks to be treated the same as Ares, but Albert immediately starts begging on her behalf and explains how he finally learned what it means to be a hero by watching them. When Tis finally wakes up, Rudy decides to forgive Theodora since she healed her, but says she will not be living as the hero anymore. She further explains that Theodora would be perfect for the job because she is the one most dedicated to saving lives. But then Gideon tells them that anyone can choose to become a hero as long as they make the decision out of love instead of blindly following destiny. Early the next day, he steps outside the shop to think of a way to fix everything Ares broke. But then Rudy shows up with Tis and starts playing with the snow. When Rit also comes out and tells her to be careful, she tells them not to worry because catching a cold is the first thing on her bucket list of regular human experiences. At the breakfast table moments later, Gideon asks if she is serious about starting her own farm, so she tells him that they are actually going to buy some land later on. After Rit offers to stay back and watch the shop, he thanks her for always helping out and heads over to the chapel for Ares' funeral. Outside the chapel several minutes later, Dannon tells them that he will be heading out after a couple of days of resting, but then he asks how Shinsandan could use the sacred swords. Tis then remembers when Theodora said those swords were used by the first hero and says the first hero was likely an Azura demon like Shinsandan, which would explain why there were 6 swords. Hours later, Gideon thanks Mito and Gons for helping him fix up the place and heads inside to have tea with Rit. But she suddenly gets upset and says she was scared he would no longer see the shop as their home because of everything that happened. He then pulls her in for a hug and promises to always love her before taking her up to the room to prove it with his glizzy. After changing into something comfortable, Gideon tries to grab her jugs for the first time, but he chickens out and makes her nervous as well, so she starts tickling him. The next moment, she climbs off the bed and reveals everything before hugging him, so he finally decides to stop holding back and summons his inner Johnny Sins to make her happy. Several positions later, they start yapping about starting a family together, and after promising to stick with her forever, Gideon tells her to expect a present soon. The next day, Rudy shows up for their sibling date, so he takes her out to every nice spot in town so she can fully experience being a regular girl. Later on, she and Tis finish tending to the herbs in the shop, so she grabs Gideon's arm as her reward. But Rit immediately feels jealous and pulls his other arm into her knockers. Just as they both start laughing at each other, Megria runs inside and begs Rudy for help because a group of ogres just took over a small village. After she says they also captured all the available adventurers, Rudy looks at Gideon for advice, but he tells her to do what she wants for once. She then decides to go help out, and Tis offers to tag along, so Gideon escorts them out and promises to make her favorite drink when she returns. A couple nights later, Godwin meets Urandrala out in the woods and tells her all about Zoltan. While drinking so, she decides to go pay Rudy and Gideon a visit. With no new enemies to fight, will Gideon finally go all out with Rit? Or will he have to deal with the fact that Rudy is becoming even more obsessed with him? That's it for this video, folks. Comment part 2 for the next one, and don't forget to turn on post notifications after subscribing to make sure you never miss our recaps.